In this video, I'd like to talk about some of the render settings that I generally optimize a little bit or like to tweak the most for different results. Now, I've got my render settings over on the right here, and I'm mainly going to be talking about the render settings in the sampling and light path settings. I'm a GPU render guy. I have a fairly powerful GPU workstation, so that has multiple GPUs in it. But some of this stuff is quite important to know kind of what it does to your render more from a visual point of view than from an optimization point of view. I wanted to touch on this because a lot of people tend to sort of stick in some default values and never change them, and it could be good to understand what some of this stuff does. So the first thing I'm going to do is, these are fairly default Blender render settings or Cycles render settings, and I'm going to hit F11 here and go to the first slot, and I've rendered the scene beforehand just to show you exactly what's going on. So I've got 512 samples that I've rendered, and this took about 2 minutes to render. Now I've got a very basic scene. I've got some red, a red sort of plasticky material here. I've got a white glossy material here, and I've got some glass spheres here. Now this is not the best scene to show you sort of how to eliminate noise or fireflies, but that's not really what this is about. It's more about some of the effects that the tools that you use to do so have on the visual aspect of your scene. So if I go back to the window here, one of the first things that you might find if you're looking up stuff on the internet, and that people might tell you when you're working with samples, is that you can clamp stuff down, clamp colors down to reduce fireflies, or sometimes even to reduce a little bit of noise in some edge cases. And that's exactly what I did for the second render, but I went a little bit too far just to show you what happens when you do so. So if I set this to 1 and 1, I changed the sampling pattern here as well to correlated multi-jither. Now, I prefer this one purely from a visual point of view. Now, this is something very, very minute that most people probably don't even notice, but I prefer the noise pattern that it spits out. I think it's slightly softer and slightly more pleasing to the eye, but again, we're staring at pixels at this point, so it doesn't really matter. It's good to know that correlated multi-jither generally is better with lower sample counts, but takes a little bit longer to render than Sobol. So this is completely up to you. The default of Sobol is fine in like 99.9% of the cases. There's really not that much reason to change it. I have like I said, a very subjective reason to change it, so that's why I set it up to that. So if we go back to our rendered view, I've rendered these in advanced, and I go to my second slot, you can see what happens if we clamp down too much. We lose all of our highlights, and especially in the glass as well, we lose a little bit of clarity. So that's something that I definitely see people doing a lot. They go a little bit too far with the clamping, and you get this really dull, flat-looking image that you can't really do all that much with. So what do I do to alleviate that in case I have to use clamp? Well, I have these values of about 10 and 7 that I generally start with in most scenes, and I increase or decrease them depending on if they're really pulling down my highlights or if I still have a lot of fireflies and things in my image. Now, if you have a lot of fireflies, using a bunch of these tricks to get rid of them generally is not the better of the two solutions. If you're going to go look at some of your lighting, maybe you've got some geometry with a light emitting shader on it, things like that will produce a lot of noise regardless. So sometimes it could be good just to go have a look at your lighting itself and make sure that what you're doing over there is correct and it's not causing a lot of issues. So with these set up again, I'm going to go back to my F11. So if I go to slot 3, I've clamped these down to 10 and 7, and if I compare this with my original image, there's a very slight variation in the glass here, but we can clamp down these values without losing too much light in our scene. So that looks very similar to the original, and the render time is about the same. Some of this stuff, like if we're talking about seconds, then a lot of this stuff is margin for error. But the last thing I want to talk about is the global illumination within Cycles. So we have this scene, and standard it's set to limited global illumination, so a fair number of transparency bounces and other bounces. And I'm not going to get into these with a super technical explanation, but one of the things that I like to do is switch this to full global illumination. Now bear in mind, this is going to slow down your render significantly. the reason I'm able to use this is because I have a very powerful workstation, and I don't mind waiting that extra little bit of time. But if we go have a look at what this actually does to your final render when it comes to sort of the visual aspect of things, if I go to my fourth slot where I've enabled full GI, you can see I get way nicer light distribution. We get some of these really dark and muddy areas even over here on the right. If you keep an eye on those, you get a lot more light bleeding in through your scene, and it looks a lot nicer, in my opinion anyway. But we have doubled our render time. So this is definitely something to keep in mind. I think this applies to both CPU and GPU. Full global illumination will take a lot more time. Now the reason for this is because the light is being scattered more times, it's being bounced around a lot more in your scene. But for example, if you look at the glass over here, even though in this scene the difference is quite minute, if you've ever had issues where you have a glass object where it stays really dark, or the reflections are really dark, or you feel like it should be a lot clearer when you're looking through it, then switching to full GI, and especially if we go back over here, switching on the reflective and refractive caustics can do a lot for your scene. Bear in mind though, these caustics are definitely one of the main cases of fireflies in your image, so it'll really vary depending on your scene if you're able to use these or not. Now you could use limited global illumination and still enable the caustics, and it still gives you a little bit of a light boost in your reflections. Now the object I have here is a worst case scenario. The topology is terrible. We've got stuff sticking through each other, and it's all a glass shader. So I wanted to really hammer down on it and show you that even in this kind of situation where you've got a lot of light transferring and a lot of darkening happening because of all this intersection, the reflective and refractive caustics can still make a bit of a difference. Now, one last setting that I want to talk about as well is the filter glossy. If you've got glossy surfaces and you're still seeing fireflies in some of them, or a lot of noise, you can set the filter glossy maybe up to 1 or a little bit higher to get rid of that stuff. But just keep in mind that it will, I guess, blur out your glossy reflections a little bit, so sometimes you have a little bit of loss of detail. And with anything that's render related, it's always a bit of a give and take between your final render result and these settings that you're using. Now I'm just going to go back to the beginning, to the very first slot. So these are the default settings, and what we ended up with is a render that obviously it's twice as slow, but in my opinion, if you get a render where you don't have a lot of contrast just yet, it gives you a lot more space in compositing to do things with it, and to add contrast if needed. It's always easier to add contrast than it is to remove it, so in that case this is quite nice. Now again, we did double the render time, so it's something to keep in mind, but don't just listen to what one person says on the internet. Try this stuff out for yourself. See how it affects your final scene, and see if you have any preferences. Like I said, I like the full global illumination a lot better because it gives me a lot, in my opinion anyway, a lot more natural sort of looking shadows and highlights and light distribution in general. So with that, I hope that explains a little bit of the render settings that I like to mess with and that I play with sort of to get my final end result. And rather than doing a whole optimization thing, I wanted to show you that a lot of these settings are also able to be used for creative effect. Like I said, I prefer the image that comes from the global illumination, and I don't mind taking the hidden render time because it does look a lot better to me. So that's something to keep in mind, and yeah, happy rendering.